Now, looking at the Ottoman Empire, what we see in the 16th century is really, with the exception of Spain, the most explosive expansion, territorial expansion of any state in that century. And this period of rapid expansion in the Ottoman Empire essentially begins to accelerate in the mid-15th century. And a kind of crucial or main event that sets forward that that development is the fall of Constantinople in 1453. We talked about that last week, if you'd remember, right? The Ottomans siege and take over Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, which essentially spells both the closing of the Silk Roads, the closure of important kind of venues of travel for many Europeans, Italians in particular, but it also spells the end of the Byzantine Empire. And there had been a gradual conquest by the Ottomans of the Balkans, which are situated in southeastern Europe, right? We have Albania, we have Yugoslavia in modern days, Kosovo, that area. You can see them on the map on one of the PowerPoints here. That had been going on since the late 14th century. And Constantinople, of course, is significant because when it falls, the remaining eastern part of the Roman Empire falls. But it's also, of course, important because it was and is an immensely valuable port between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Right? This is the gateway to the East, or had been for centuries, for Europeans in general and for Italian merchants in particular. And it is made into a very diverse, prosperous imperial capital by Mehmed II, who we'll get back to in a second. Also, in the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire conquered large tracts of Anatolian farmland. The Anatolian steppe is situated in modern-day Turkey. So a lot of valuable farmland is being incorporated into the Ottoman Empire. So first, Selim I from 1512 to 1520, and after him, Solyman I, Solyman the Magnificent, from 1520 to 1566. These two rulers used both of these resources to continue to expand the empire's territory. They did that by ensuring virtual monopoly on trade, the economic powerhouse that was Constantinople on one hand, and then farmland, a sort of breadbasket for the empire, where produce, crops, food could be produced and dispersed. So it goes rapidly from there, right? So early 16th century, you have Syria, Palestine conquered by the Ottomans. That means that most of the Arabic peoples and tribes are now gradually under Ottoman control. Around the same time, Egypt becomes essentially a tributary state of the Ottoman Empire. It extends influence all the way to Tunisia, Algeria in northern Africa. 1526, the Ottomans move further west in Europe, and they are taking over parts of Hungary. They essentially are knocking on the gates of Vienna in 1529. That's about as far as they get west in Europe. They take Cyprus in 1570, and then around 1638, in the 17th century, Baghdad, which had been under the influence of different Islamic empires and then taken over by the Mongols for a period of time, and then in the mid-17th century, a more firm border is established with the Safavid Empire, or the Persian Empire, to the east. In terms of governing system, the Ottoman governing system, you'd say that during the 16th century, the institutions of society and government that had been evolving in the Ottoman Empire for centuries reached what we call the classical forms and patterns. So a form of organizing and establishing social and government norms come into place in the 16th century that reach all the way into the 20th. So what we have with the Ottomans is a basic division between the small ruling class of Ottomans and then the vast majority of subjects who had no power but were granted protection from the state, right? So the ruling classes of Ottomans, in other words, saw the people that were in their possessions and under their control as a quote-unquote protected flock, right? You didn't have any political rights per se, but you did have a right to be supported and protected by your rulers. And the way you gained power and influence was through, first of all, profession of absolute loyalty to the Sultan, an acceptance and practice of Islam, and then a kind of demonstration that you had a deep knowledge of the workings of the state. You knew their customs, their languages, their law, etc. So it is entirely possible within the Ottoman Empire to move through the ranks and to very powerful positions without, let's say, any hereditary claims. You can move through the system on merit and skill. There was a complexity, though, to this meritocracy. So essentially, members of the ruling class both acquired the same kind of social status that their masters had, but they were at the same time legally slaves, right? They were enslaved by the Sultan. And as slaves, their properties, the things that they owned, their land, buildings, and lives were entirely at his disposition. So generally, wealth was not hereditary. Once you died, your possessions would go back to the Sultan. And this class of what we call service nobility. You have similar systems in the Russian Empire, for example. That was markedly different from the aristocratic feudalism of Europe, where, first of all, land, wealth was owned by the aristocracy, where nobility, status, political power is hereditary, right? If you're a count or a duke, then your son will become one too. And where you, again in Europe, have power and wealth that is based on kinship, on family, not ability. So all of these things are essentially not there for in the Ottoman Empire. And what's the result? Well, one of the results is that Ottoman rulers, Ottoman sultans, had a lot more power and control over the ruling classes. since virtually everyone, was enslaved. So the revolts of the aristocracy that you see once we move into, well, definitely the 18th century, right? The amassing of power, political power by the landed gentry in France and England and other places, that would be a non-starter in the Ottoman Empire. So you also had a standing army, a standing elite army, which was also one of the more awe-inspiring elements of the Ottoman Empire at its prime. This army had almost 40,000 janissaries, right? Again, janissaries, a form of elite soldier. They could match any military force in the world. Their navy essentially supplanted Genoa, Venice as the strongest power in the Eastern Mediterranean and in the Black Sea. And these janissaries, right, were often commissioned or consisted of people who either were captured by other Ottoman soldiers, or they signed up, or they were perhaps sold by families to join the military ranks of the Ottoman Empire. And these people came from all over, right? From Northern Africa, Middle East, the Baltics, the Balkans, all over Eastern, Northeastern Europe. So all of these people came in, let's say, on loyalty and merit, and sometimes forcefully. But it created an enormously specialized and highly effective army. And then you had the Topkapi in Istanbul, right, which was the enormous imperial palace of the Ottoman Empire. You also have an image of that in one of the PowerPoints in this set, right? This was the imperial palace. It had more than 5,000 residents. It was a little society unto itself. It housed the imperial family. It housed state officials, soldiers, servants, concubines to the Sultan and to other high-ranking officials or members of the empire. And then at the very core, the very center of the palace, you had the imperial harem, right, or haram. This is where women were living. I was going to say housed, but this was the residence of the women, the eunuchs, of which there were several. Male family members were allowed to go in, but it was absolutely not open to the public or any unrelated male. But the harem, even though it was, let's say, completely isolated from not just the rest of the palace, but the world outside, still held, let's say, significant power, but power that was indirect, right? So the Sultan's wives, when we move into the 16th century, the Sultan's sons, all the children he had with his concubines or his wives, all of these people were in here. So it was kind of a microcosm of imperial power, and also often a power place.